When we all heard Russia was invading Ukraine, we were sure that Ukraine was done for. But recent military developments show that Ukraine has the upper hand, invading Russia in Kursk. The Ukrainians have been blowing up bridges, which has left Russian troops stranded. If there's a lesson to pick from the exchange between the two nations, it's that numbers and equipment aren't everything. On the 20th of August, 2024, the world woke up to rather interesting news. Ukrainian troops had trapped Russian soldiers in Kursk. About 3,000 Russian troops had been trapped on the south side of the Seim River, which is in Russia's Kursk Oblast, because Ukrainian troops had somehow managed to blow up the bridges connected to that area. This is a headline no one saw happening 2 years ago. This was the result of a series of coordinated strikes over a number of days by Ukraine's army and air force. They managed to destroy all 3 permanent bridges across the area, which severed critical Russian supply lines. Given how important these bridges were, Russian engineers rushed to mobilize pontoon bridges to replace the destroyed ones. But the Ukrainians expected this and laid in wait. They launched a multi-pronged counteroffensive, making use of explosive first-person view drones to target and destroy the convoys transporting the pontoon bridge sections. They also fired rockets at the boats and pontoons already in the water. By preemptively targeting the Russian engineers and their equipment, Ukraine significantly hampered Russia's ability to support its trapped troops, increasing pressure on the isolated forces in the region. This had left up to 3,000 Russian troops trapped on the south side of the Seim River in Russia's Kursk Oblast region. There was no way out of the situation, and sources close to the area stated that the Russian troops were highly demotivated and unwilling to fight. That was good news for Ukraine, as they were attempting to push eastward through that part of Kursk with the sole aim of trapping the Russian troops. While some had hoped that the Russians could defend themselves if need be, open data analysis experts like Julian Rybka, who works at Build, explained that even though the west of the cauldron may be prepared for defense, the Russians will struggle to defend themselves if attacked by Ukrainian armed forces from the east. They didn't have much of a choice though, as their only options were to either defend or retreat. Neither of these two options had a good ending, as they would both deal fatal blows to the Russians. Defending means they are likely to have lots of casualties on their side, whereas retreating means they would have to abandon their vehicles and equipment, which leaves them vulnerable to Ukrainian aviation, artillery, and drones. In the west, Ukraine had already crossed the border and taken control of a 15 square kilometer area up to the Seim River, where the Yotruba farm is located. In response to this, Russia started to form new battle groups to help them manage the Ukrainian invasion. Kursk was not the only area Ukraine had been successful in raiding. No, they had success with border raids occurring in Bryansk and Belgorod regions. Ukraine had proven to Russia that their efforts were not ones to be ignored. The new troop groups created in response to their raids were Belgorod, Bons, and Kursk. Russian troop groups were initially operating only within Ukraine because that's where the action was. With Ukraine's new advancements, the creation of these groups became necessary, and the Coordination Council for Military Security of Border Territories, led by Defense Minister Andrei Belou, will oversee the actions of these army groups. President Vladimir Putin was far from impressed about these developments and has given his troops till the 1st of October to retake Kursk while maintaining their advantage in key areas of Donbass. Despite the losses at Kursk, President Putin has asked that Russia continue its offensive, especially in Puv and Toret. If you haven't been following the war, you might be wondering why Ukraine is advancing into enemy territory in the first place. The answer is pretty simple. It's an attempt at liberating Ukrainians that are in Russian captivity. This was confirmed by President Volodymyr Zelensky himself when he provided the objectives of the Kursk invasion. As of the 20th of August, Ukraine had control over 1,250 square kilometers of enemy territory and 92 settlements. This is changing every day in favor of Ukraine. Despite the advancements made, not everyone in Ukraine is happy with the way things are going. Mariana Bezula, for instance, who is a member of Ukraine's National Security, Defense and Intelligence Committee, criticized the government's decision to leave Donetsk Oblast vulnerable, especially as Russian troops press closer to Puv and Toret. Speculations have been running wild on what the true intention of Ukraine's advancements may be, with writers like Boris Ron stating that Ukraine may be preparing to strike the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which has been under Russian control since the early days of the war. Although Ukraine has stated it has no intentions of capturing the plant, Russian troops have begun digging trenches in the area. No matter how you look at it though, Ukraine's destruction of the bridges has left the Russians with no easy way into that part of Kursk. The Ukrainians can, however, enter the area by crossing the border. The airspace isn't a safer alternative as the Ukrainians have effectively cleared the air over Kursk. They are firing surface-to-air missiles and deploying FPV drones as aerial runs, which have allowed them to shoot down several Russian helicopters since they started their invasion of the area on the 6th of August 2024. But how has a relatively smaller nation like Ukraine managed to keep a giant like Russia at arm's length after 2 years of war? Also, did Ukraine always have this much firepower and resources available? Well, to answer this question, let's start by looking at the weapons involved in the invasion of Kursk. A recent video from the invasion featured a Ukrainian MiG-29 fighter, which was seen deploying French-made ASM-250 Hammer precision-guided bombs. It's also believed that the Ukrainian FPV drones intercepted some of the bridging units while they were still on the road and targeted others as they were setting up the pontoon sections. In a dramatic move, Ukrainian forces used US-made HIMARS rockets, which scattered hundreds of grenade-sized bomblets over one of the pontoons. Ukraine's airborne assault troops also released footage that showed a German-donated Murder infantry fighting vehicle from the 95th Separate Assault Brigade attacking a Russian position in the Kursk village of Malaya. If you have been listening, then it should be obvious where Ukraine's firepower is coming from. Since its allies in the West and the EU cannot directly engage Russia in this war, they have been supplying Ukraine with the needed firepower to defend themselves and take down Russia. Aside from being supplied with firepower and receiving help, Ukraine is capturing powerful equipment from the Russians. An example is a Russian T-90M tank, which they reportedly captured near the town of Snag on the western edge of their advance. It's one thing to have firepower though, and another to use it effectively. This is where Ukraine's fastest and best equipped brigade, the 80th Air Assault Brigade, comes in. On the third day of Ukraine's surprise attack on Russia, it was confirmed that this brigade was involved. A clip circulating days before the events of 20th August on social media showed a T-64BV or T-80BV tank, a UR-77 mine-clearing vehicle, an IMAR-2 engineering vehicle, plus BTR-80 and US-made striker-wheeled armored personnel carriers rolling past a busy Ukrainian mortar crew. The vehicles were armored with anti-drone cages. Ukraine's 80th Air Assault Brigade, like the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, uses Murders and Strikers. For those unfamiliar with them, Murders are heavy and Strikers are fast, which aligns with the Ukrainian Air Assault Forces' strategy of quick yet powerful attacks. The 80th Air Assault Brigade is the only Ukrainian unit that uses a mix of Soviet and ex-American vehicles. A video from a Russian drone confirmed their involvement by showing their strikes on ex-German Murder fighting vehicles in Kursk Oblast. The fact that the 80th Air Assault Brigade, one of Ukraine's elite units, was shown to be involved in the operation earlier on highlights the scale of the operation. Since the war started, small raids have been conducted by Ukrainian fighters in an attempt to embarrass Russian leaders at the borders. Seeing so many skilled fighters involved in the operation should have served as a warning to Russian leaders, as they confirmed that at least 3 brigades, including the 22nd and 88th Mechanized Brigades and the 80th Air Assault Brigade, were involved with up to 2,000 troops in each. As if that was not enough, they had artillery, drones, and air defenses playing crucial supporting roles. So while we mentioned in the intro that the world woke up to the news, it's one that had been slowly building up. There was no guarantee they were going to be successful because even though Ukraine had up When we all heard Russia was invading, the world woke up to the news. It's one that had been slowly building up. There was no guarantee they were going to be successful because even though Ukraine had up to 10,000 troops in the invasion zone, they were up against 48,000 Russian troops from the northern grouping of forces. It's only safe to say that Ukraine has been strategic in its battles within the invasion zone. Strategy is probably what enabled Ukrainian forces to enjoy the success they have so far. It seems that Ukrainian brigades intentionally crossed the border where Russian defenses were weakest. The Ukrainian Center for Defense Strategies noted that the Ukrainian command successfully achieved operational surprise. Ukraine risked thousands of troops that would have been difficult to replace if their brigades had advanced too quickly and outpaced their artillery, air defenses, and supply lines. They could have found themselves isolated and outgunned deep inside Kursk Oblast. Based on recent events, however, it can be said that their gamble might have paid off. Despite the success, Ukraine's President Zelensky also criticized the international community for being too concerned about Russian President Vladimir Putin's threats. He argued that if Ukraine's allies allowed Ukraine to use long-range weapons inside Russia without restrictions, Ukraine wouldn't have to physically enter the Kursk region to protect its citizens and stop Russia from being able to attack. Just in case you didn't know, even though Ukraine was given a lot of weapons and equipment to use in its defense, they came with conditions. One of the major ones is that Ukraine is only allowed to use long-range weapons within its territory and not Russia's territory. If they were allowed to use them in Russian territory, it could change the dynamic of the war, and that's what Ukraine's President Zelensky is concerned about. Things might be changing soon, though not necessarily with Ukraine but with other EU countries. At the recently ended NATO's 75th anniversary summit, it was announced that the US will periodically be deploying long-range missiles in Germany for the first time since the Cold War. A treaty from 1988 between the US and the former Soviet Union would have made this illegal. This was the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces or INF treaty signed at the end of the Cold War, which prohibited ground-launched missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers or 310 to 3,400 miles. In a perfect world, the parties involved would have adhered to their end of the bargain, but our world is not so perfect, now is it? Russian President Vladimir Putin found the treaty too restrictive, and in 2014, the US accused Russia of violating it with a new nuclear-capable cruise missile. This led to an eventual withdrawal of the US from the treaty in 2019, and Russia followed. With the treaty out of the way, there's basically nothing stopping the US from deploying the long-range missiles in Germany. These will include Tomahawk cruise missiles, Seim 6, and hypersonic missiles, which have much longer ranges than current systems. Naturally, some German politicians, particularly from the Greens, criticized Germany's decision to allow US missiles on German soil. The US and Germany clarified that the deployment of these missiles is only the first of many steps in the US's commitment to NATO and Europe's integrated deterrence. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius explained at the NATO summit in Washington that the goal is to encourage Germany and other European nations to invest in developing and acquiring their own longer-range missiles. The temporary deployment will give NATO allies time to prepare for this shift. Pistorius, along with defense ministers from France, Italy, and Poland, signed the agreement to develop long-range missiles in Europe. This European long-range strike approach aims to improve Europe's missile capabilities. Now, each of the missiles we mentioned is a powerhouse on its own. The Tomahawk cruise missile, for instance, was first used in the 1980s, has a range of over 1,000 miles and can be redirected mid-flight, making it highly versatile. The recent version, known as the Block 4, has a range of 1,350 miles and carries a 1,000-pound high-explosive conventional warhead. The Seim 6 missile was also originally designed for air defense and has a shorter range of 287 miles but can reach speeds of Mach 3.5, making it ideal for quick strikes on time-sensitive targets. To put it in perspective, it's up to 4 times faster than the Tomahawk. Both of these missiles are launched from a newly developed transporter erector and launcher system called the Typhoon. It consists of 4 Mk-41 vertical launch systems and missile launchers used on US, Japanese, and NATO warships. Each Mk-41 can hold one missile. While these are great, none can compare to the LRHW, which was dubbed the Super Duper Missile by former President Trump. It's a hypersonic weapon that's capable of reaching speeds up to Mach 17 and hitting targets up to 1,700 miles away with extreme precision. Once launched, the LRHW boosts high into the upper atmosphere and then deploys a hypersonic glide body, an aerodynamic projectile that includes the guidance system and warhead. The glide body then straightens out and coasts back to Earth, conducting evasive maneuvers at high speeds to avoid interception. The LRHW only exists because the US withdrew from the treaty. It wouldn't have been able to develop it if it were still part of the treaty, as the agreements prevented both parties from doing so. Although Russia denied it, the US government claims it received intel that Russia was testing a new cruise missile with a range of 1,500 miles. This was in direct infringement of the agreement of the treaty, and when Russia was confronted, it denied ever doing so. The US got NATO involved, and once it had enough backing, it pulled out. They started to develop their own system that could counter Russia, and the result is the LRHW. I just realized I haven't spelled out in full what the LRHW is. It simply means long-range hypersonic weapon, and from everything I've said, you should understand why it's called that. But how does Russia feel about all this? Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov has warned that they will respond militarily to this new threat. He also accused NATO and the US of escalating tensions and trying to intimidate Russia. Another Russian official, known as Dmitry Peskov, described it as being a very serious threat for which they would take thoughtful, coordinated, and effective measures to contain NATO. Clearly, Russia isn't happy with what's going on, but the US insists that they started it. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan responded firmly, stating, "What we are deploying to Germany is a defensive capability, like many other defensive capabilities we've deployed across the alliance over the decades. More Russian saber-rattling is not going to deter us from doing what we think is necessary to keep the alliance as strong as possible." We also know that President Putin has given his military the whole of September to make things right with KK and regain control of the area. While that's easier said than done, President Putin's subordinates know better than to disappoint him. So how do you think this ends? Will Ukraine keep surviving Russia's onslaught and take some territories for itself as the war goes on, or do you think it's only a matter of time until their luck runs out? Share your thoughts in the comments section. If you enjoyed this, check out our next video now on your screen. See you there.